World War I began on the 28th of July 1914 and lasted over 4 years, ending on the 11th of November 1918. Over 20 million people from 32 different countries lost their lives. Bombs from the German Zeppelins alone killed hundreds. The contribution of the Zeppelin airships is a mystery to many. The Zeppelins first invaded England in 1915. In Essex, houses were destroyed and residents lost their lives from the bombs the Zeppelins dropped en route to London. So, how did England defend itself from these aerial beasts? What led to the downfall of the L-32 and L-33 Zeppelins? What happened to these titans of the sky?
This may look like any other British field, but over 100 years ago, this was a place of death and destruction. In this documentary, we'll learn a little bit more about the rigid airships used by the Germans in the First World War, known as the Zeppelins. Now, contrary to popular belief, Zeppelins were actually very difficult to shoot down. So how did one man manage to bring down the L-32 Zeppelin in this field? And how was the L-33 successfully defeated by anti-aircraft guns, causing it to crash nearby?
Late at night, on the 23rd of September 1916, 12 Zeppelins were en route from Germany to attack England, with many targeting London. Searchlights and multiple biplanes were sent out in pursuit of finding these Zeppelins. The RFC's planes were the only aspect of home defense used by Britain. One of the pilots sent was Second Lieutenant Frederick Sowry.
Welcome to Stowe-Marie's Great War Aerodrome Museum, the best preserved World War I aerodrome in Europe. This is similar to the one at RFC Sutton Farm, where Frederick began his flight on that fateful day. This map shows the locations of RFC airfields from Ringsted all the way down to Lair Green. There are over 150 airfields across Britain. Zeppelins were massive. If one was to land right now, its size would span from here to here.
Now, what would being an RFC pilot really be like?
This is the pilot's ready room, where pilots would get changed into their uniforms and get ready to set off on their rounds.
This is a squadron office. In this room, the squadron leader, who is of a higher rank than flight lieutenants, would create and store any admin paperwork. This is also where the pilots would sign up to work. This is where the pilots would have rested. This is where the planes would have originally taken off, including the BE-2 biplane, the type flown by Second Lieutenant Frederick Sowry.
So let's meet some incredible people who can tell us a little bit more about how these aircraft and Zeppelin ran during the First World War. Hello.
Hello.
Steve, is it?
That's Steve, yep. How you doing? Bruno?
Bruno, absolutely.
Hi. How you doing?
To meet you.
And you as well. What can I tell you about?
Oh, well, you can tell me about these amazing machines.
This is gorgeous. I mean, is this what the aircraft would have looked like at the time?
Indeed, this is called a BE-2E, and it's one of the very early Royal Flying Corps aircraft, designed in 1912 at the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough, designed for the Royal Flying Corps as an observation aircraft.
Observation, I'm guessing, recon,
taking
checking
pictures, spotting basically what was going on behind the German lines.
So how were they actually built? What kind of machines did they use?
Okay, most of this aircraft would have been built by hand. So in those days, of course, there wasn't much technology available to the guys. So carpenters would have hand carved all of the wood bits that you're seeing. The metal would have been pressed in workshops. Obviously the engine part's the same, but everything would have been assembled by hand.
Incredible. And the RFC pilots, I mean, who were they and what did they do?
So they decided to form the Royal Flying Corps out of the Royal Engineers. The balloon company of the Royal Engineers was formed in 1911, and they took part in the first, the army trials of that year on Salisbury Plain, and reconnaissance was the thing that they did. And so that was the idea that the generals got in their heads, that that's what we're going to use them for.
That's lovely. I mean, so when they were actually fighting these Titanic Zeppelins, I mean, what were the strategies or ammunition that they used to bring these Titans down?
So in the early days, a Lewis gun was the infantry section machine gun. So it was equipped with machine gun bullets, the same as a rifle, essentially. Just fired more bullets in a shorter length of time. You're restricted in the arc of fire that you have. So basically you can only fire between these wires and the prop. So you've got about 10 degrees that you can actually shoot. So if that was a Zeppelin, they'd try and come up alongside it and let go.
So they must have taken quite a while for an airplane like this to reach the height of the Zeppelin, because they were fairly high up in the sky, weren't they?
Okay, these aircraft are pretty slow compared to aircraft of today. The top speed of this one is around about 65 miles an hour, which is about a 10-mile overtaking speed on a Zeppelin. So by the time they'd got the actual warning that the raid was incoming, it's probably about an hour to an hour and a half after the raid's first been spotted that they've got to get off the ground and get up to height. So the raid isn't going to be where they thought it was. They've then got to climb to 10,000 feet, which is about the normal height of a Zeppelin coming over, and that would take them around about 45 minutes to do that.
My goodness.
So 2 hours after the raid's first spotted, you've got aircraft up there actually looking for the Zeppelin raids.
Trevor.
Hi,
Bruno, lovely to meet you.
and you.
How's it going?
Not so bad. How can I help you?
Well, we'd love to know a little bit more about Zeppelins.
Fine. You shoot the questions, I'll file the answers.
Gorgeous, sounds lovely. Well, my first question to fire is, who originally created the Zeppelin?
The original Zeppelin was actually designed by a chap called Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, and he was born in the Bavarian district, Württemberg, Bavaria. And they manufactured the Zeppelins initially at a place called Friedrichshafen in Germany on Lake Constance.
Wow, that's incredible. And what were the Zeppelins made from? What was the original materials?
It depends on who was the manufacturer. Zeppelins used something called duralium for the basic rigid structure, whereas a company called Schutzlanz, they used plywood and wood throughout.
What pieces of weaponry or bombs how were they stored within the Zeppelin?
They had 7.92mm Maxim Nordenfeldt guns. There'd be 7 or 8 on each Zeppelin. They would be housed in the gondolas and at the front and at rear of the Zeppelin. The bombs were also stored inside the envelope and on the gondolas originally, and they would be thrown over the side. Literally thrown over the side. The later ones were all internally hung vertically.
Wow. And how did they navigate?
Primarily through the use of rivers. When they approached the English coast, the Blackwater, the Crouch and the Thames all point directly towards London. So it's quite easily, and particularly on a moon, when there was a full moon, the reflection made it very easy for them.
That's so there must have been a few jobs running around the Zeppelin, because the crew size was usually around 20.
Yep,
Right?
anything up to 20, 21. Be the captain, navigator, bomb aimer, a lot of engineers, gunners, just about everything that you can possibly imagine.
So, knowing what you know now about what caused some of the Zeppelins to crash, how would you design a modern airship?
I probably wouldn't. There are airships flying around now, much more modern construction, much lighter materials, and primarily using an inert gas, which means they're not vulnerable to any form of fire of any description. but militarily, I cannot see personally, I cannot see a use for it.
So what actually happened that night? Frederick left his base in search of the L-32 Zeppelin after being attracted by the concentrated attention of searchlights to an area of the sky to the east. Flying at 13,000 feet, he spotted Zeppelin L-32 just after it passed the Thames River at 0100 hours. At about 0110 hours, he closed in. The Germans began trying to shoot Frederick down, but with no success. He fired 3 drums of incendiary ammunition into the belly of the gas bag before it exploded into flames. In his pilot's report, he wrote, "The first 2 drums of ammunition had apparently no effect, but the third one caused the envelope to catch fire in several places, in the center and the front. It was a David and Goliath battle." No members of the aircrew survived. Most of the recovering bodies were charred and burned. The burning wreckage in Snell Farm drew enormous crowds.
Later, Inspector Alan Ellis arrived at the scene and began securing the area around the L-32 crash. Then the souvenir hunting began. Members of the public travelling from Billericay train station on bike or by foot started to steal pieces of metal from the Zeppelin frame as souvenirs. Soldiers with bayonets and members of the local police force attempted to stop the souvenir hunters and tradespeople who had set up stalls such as lemonade stands in an attempt to profit from the event. This is the Cater Museum, a small museum located on the Billericay High Street. It houses a range of artefacts from both the First and Second World War.
Katie, hello. Hi. Bruno, lovely to meet you.
You too.
So, you're the creator of the museum.
Yes, yeah, it's a good job.
It's a good job.
Yeah.
How long have you been working here?
Since October 2015, so good
Oh,
few
wow.
years now.
I mean, how do you think you would feel if a Zeppelin was going to fly above us right now?
Well, if it was wartime, I'd be a bit concerned. They,
Yeah.
you know, they were silent killers.
Oh, they were silent.
Pretty much, yeah. They were sort of. They were so high up, people couldn't hear them. If they were if it was cloud cover as well, that was, you know, that would muffle everything, and it would make it especially hard for the planes to spot and the spotters with their searchlights to help out the planes. And that was due to the new technology of incendiary bullets. So the people that shot down this Zeppelin, Sowry, he remembered that process of using incendiary bullets with regular bullets, and that's how it came down, and that's how it came down on fire.
That you essentially, he found out their weakness, as it were.
Yeah, and after that they, you know, you say, you know, how would I feel? But after this sort of event, people were, you know, yeah, exactly.
We know how to bring them down, it's
Yeah.
absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Because I think you've got some letters here. I mean,
Yes.
what must have it been like to read these letters, the eyewitness accounts at the time?
Well, it was amazing, really, but just the range of emotions that people felt.
Yeah.
You know, some people were saying how brilliant it was, how people were celebrating. Others were saying, you know, mothers were weeping because it was, you know, they saw their own children in these men that came down. And
But they took things back, didn't they? And what is this story about the candlestick holders? What was that about?
Well, the candlesticks we have in this case,
Oh, right.
they're... I'll get them out.
Oh, yes, please.
Yes. So these were taken from... There were some elements of wood in the Zeppelins, not much because due to the gases that they used, and they didn't want anything too inflammatory, understandably. But these were taken by a local man, turned into these candlesticks and handed down to his family, and these came in about a couple of months ago.
Wow, it's a recent
2019.
discovery then. That's incredible.
Yes, yeah. So as I say, they just come out of the, you know,
The woodwork, really.
The woodwork, yes. Okay, so on this side we have a few other elements. So this is relating to Frederick Sowry, the man who shot it down.
The man himself, wow.
The man himself. We've got a model of the plane. This is another piece, one of our large pieces of the Zeppelin. This was sort of found, let's say, by a local hairdresser.
Oh my
In
goodness.
fact, we've got a picture of him on the wall here, Frederick Vere.
Oh wow.
And on this side we've got a few contemporary newspaper pieces.
That's
from,
lovely. I guess this kind of explains how really the country reacted as a whole, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean the Daily Chronicle was a national newspaper. They couldn't report everything, so they all they could really say was the 2 Zeppelins came down in Essex. Although everyone in London, everyone sort of in the area knew exactly where they were.
And it must have. Did it have like a lasting effect on the lives of the local residents who had to experience the crash?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was. Obviously, people kept their pieces. It became part of their family tradition to pass these objects down. So it's not just sort of 100 years ago and then 100 years later, but there's been sort of increments in between, and people still, produce newspaper articles about it, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's just been part of Billericay fabric. This event.
That's a lovely way of putting it. Part of the fabric, part of the rich history.
Yeah.
Those who died in the L-32 crash were buried with respect by the RFC and area locals here at St Mary Magdalene's Church. However, they have since been moved to the German military cemetery in Cannock Chase, Staffordshire. On the same night as the L-32 crash, the L-33 Zeppelin also crash-landed in Newhall Farm here in Little Wigborough after being shot down by anti-aircraft guns. Despite the buffeting from exploding anti-aircraft shells all around it, the Zeppelin L-33's hull was struck just behind the engine gondola by a shell most probably from the Beckton or Wanstead batteries. The shell passed right through the ship, destroying a gas holding cell, fracturing a main ring and severing portions of an axle cable, a bracing running the length of the ship. Other lifting gas holding cells were damaged by shrapnel and flying splinters. Now, the highly volatile hydrogen gas began to stream out of the hull and into the atmosphere, but miraculously it did not ignite. However, Capitan Alois Bocker must have realised that his ship was mortally stricken. The Zeppelin was then attacked by 2nd Lieutenant Alfred de Bath Brandon in his BE-2E fighter, but the Zeppelin still didn't catch fire. Eventually it landed in Compt Hall Lane, Little Wigborough at 1:20 a.m. This time the crew survived, with only one injured. After the L-33 Zeppelin landed, the German crew tried to warn those living in this cottage before burning down their entire ship to get rid of any evidence of the Zeppelin. The terrified occupants refused to open their door. The men then walked down nearby country lanes in an attempt to escape. However, they were stopped by Special Constable Nicholas on his bike and asked if they had seen a nearby Zeppelin crash. The captain, who replied in English, asked the distance to Colchester, which got the officer suspicious. So he followed the men towards Peldon, where 2 other officers took them to a nearby post office where PC Charles Smith arrested them. Eventually they were taken to the prison of war camps. Now, over 100 years later, there is still a memorial located at Snell Farm. The Zeppelin's crash had a huge impact on the Billericay area and its people. It's only a small part of this town's rich history and a fraction of a larger historical story, but an important one. People will always remember the Great War and the titans that once filled our skies.
Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. While you balloon the front to light your fag, smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. Oh, pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. Private Perks went a marching into Flanders with his smile, his sunny smile.